Hello everybody, and welcome. This is my second attempt to record on the topic of music. The first one was plagued by mic sensitivity, and you'll probably hear a little noise from the mic even on this one, but I'm using my older headset, which seems to be less sensitive. Also, so the last recording that I attempted to make was plagued with noise, but I also managed to stir up the suspicion of various neighbors while walking around late at night trying to record a podcast, and ended up having a rather tense encounter with a carload of people, and then shortly thereafter an encounter with the police. I assure you that great fun was had by all, and hopefully to some degree these issues have been put to rest for the moment. But it's useful to maintain situational awareness wherever we may be, and so as to not arouse undue suspicion and, other kinds of problems. So now I am again walking late at night. And I think I began the last recording with a bit of a bird walk on the topic of having meaningful roles. Yes, because it is Halloween in our Western calendar, and this is a time when everybody dresses up and gets to select a character or a monster or something to play at being. And the problem I think we have is that much of our play styles and abilities end up getting captured by our culture and commodified and iconized and photographed, and right, it's a big spectacle charade. And this is unfortunate, but we do live circa 2022, and it is the far future of my now distant childhood. I always loved Halloween as a child, and it should be clear that many of the symbols of Halloween are phenological symbols. These are symbols of the transformation of the season, and particularly the beginning of winter, which for many people is a time of great trial, crisis, and often death. So the bats come out much more in this season. Of course, there are pumpkins and all kinds of, changes in the trees and the foods that we will eat and share. But for most of human history, the winters were harsh. Food stores tended to spoil or run out, and everyone struggled to get through and often had to share food. In small communal enclaves, this is a natural thing to do. Everyone keeps each other alive. But in our culture, though there are some avenues through which we may give and share with others, mostly we tend to keep to ourselves. But I loved dressing up for Halloween and was very excited to have some kind of distinctive costume, and loved the role-playing aspect of it. Later in my life, when I came back from the street after being a runaway, I was engaged with people who were pretty deeply interested, mostly in getting intoxicated and causing trouble. And we used to get into plenty of trouble and smoked a lot of pot and did whatever we could, but that wore thin fairly quickly for me. And I was very lucky to encounter a small group of math geeks, some of whom I'd been to elementary school with, who were playing Dungeons and Dragons. And this is circa early 80s, right? So these were pen and paper games with dice, tabletop games. We played D&D, Arduin, RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu, Traveler. We played war games with miniatures, Starfleet battles, box games like Kingmaker and Dune. And we were extremely addicted to it. I had never imagined there was something this amazing and fun to do together. And it was all happening in our imaginations, right? The scenes, the roles that we played, the characters we played, they weren't like video games at all. We actually were acting out the characters, so we got to try on alternate identities. And this was really one of the most important features of my life at that time. I made new friends. We became very tightly bonded. We adventured together in imaginary worlds. It was really, really fun. We would often play for as long as we possibly could, right? Like 10, 15, 20 hours. And whenever we weren't working or otherwise occupied, you could pretty much find the pod that we formed gaming together somewhere at one of our houses. I think it's really important to understand that being human is an experiment. And the situation is fundamentally experimental in the sense of inviting fantasy, imaginary play, exploring different ways of being myself or being together with other people, all of these kinds of things. And Halloween at least has a bit of the role-playing aspect in it. And so I think that part of it can be fun. And it's strange that we just do it one day a year. We have one day where I guess we're supposed to get all that out of your system. Yeah. A crude authority figure might say. But the seasons are changing. The insect life here, the praying mantises are approaching their final life phase. And many of the insects and which insects are common have changed dramatically. There are some late season wasps, but I feel very trenchantly the shift in the season. It's surprising to me that in none of my previous videos have I muchly spoken of music. And it's such a rich and important topic. I want you to remember and think for a moment of some of the first few songs you heard that really had a deep impact on you or that you identified with in a profound way. And just take a moment and remember them. When I was younger, we lived in the time of LP records. So we would buy vinyl. And when compact discs began to emerge, we were very skeptical about the technology for lots of reasons. Turns out that testing has determined that apparently LP records are capturing and reproducing frequencies in a way that digital recordings can't. Which isn't too surprising for us kids of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. When we begin to speak of music, my early memories are so profound. Music had an incredible effect on me. I sang all the time as a child, along with the radio. And growing up listening to music, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, even popular music was fairly rich and poetically sophisticated. Songs told stories like The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia. And record albums were really a bit like a doorway into another universe. The incredible artistry and fascinating novel visual experience of just going to a record store and paging through the albums. You can see here that there's some aspect of role-playing involved, right? The bands are actually presenting a sort of meta-identity to the public through their music and the artwork that adorns the album covers and so on. And so to buy an album was to begin to participate in other worlds. Amazing worlds of imagination, adventure, confusion, mystery. And the Beatles were extremely influential. But the music that we listened to on the radio when I was young, even the quote pop music unquote, was theatrical and poetically rich. I quail to think at most of what goes on these days, because those traditions have been transformed by culture, and so much of our quote popular music, it's difficult to really even imagine that it's music. It seems to be much more mechanized and follow very clumsy, simple tropes. And there's plenty of exceptions. It's not the only thing that's going on. But in my youth, the record albums were really like doorways to other universes. And while we were listening to the incredible music and creativity and poetic beauty of the songs, we were transported. Now, certainly all music works on us in somewhat this way. But popular music has degraded into something that only slightly resembles music, and most of its poetics have been dragged down to the place where, they can reach the vast, swarming, half-educated masses. And that's unfortunate. All of the arts of creativity, music and acting and dance, drawing and painting, writing, especially poetry or song, all of these things are places where we begin to depart from the tedious and rather empty everyday world into not merely a different world, but a different experience of ourselves. And many of us felt feelings of heroism or a call to establish our destinies and so on from songs. They were the actual church outside the regular religion. Their effect on culture was rich, deep, and astonishingly transformative in both senses of the word, right? They changed our culture, they expressed our culture, and they inspired us deeply. The word music is related to something most of us moderns would dismiss as old superstition or religion or something like this. In our understanding of Greek thought and records, we find that Zeus mates with mnemosyne, effectively memory, and begets the muses. And there are different versions of, how many there are, what they oversee. There's epic poetry, lyric poetry, history, linguistics, right? Rhetoric and sophistry in a way. And then different muses, perhaps one or two muses for different modes of music. And rather than having been sloppy thinkers, the Greeks were, by all appearances, deeply philosophically minded, and so had a very rich banquet of ways of knowing that allowed them to see into features of our humanity or experience or the nature of the sky that have long been lost for most of us. But the idea that the muses are beings is not unfamiliar to creative people the world around. Our music, when we make it, comes into us from somewhere. Yeah? And anyone who composes, even if it's poetry or writing, knows that there's an unusual situation as regards where and how our creativity originates. Where does the dancer's dance come from? Where does the singer's song originate? And many of the songs in the 60s and 70s had this bizarre, intense, timeless sort of feeling, as if we're not merely stepping out of the ordinary world, we're stepping into an incredibly unexpected relationship with time. This should not be surprising, as most of music is in a way a kind of playing around, as in orbiting, synchronizations and transformations over time. So the music actually temporalizes our experience in a way that's not common to our everyday activities and contexts. There were a few songs that stood out to me, and I myself began to become a musician. Though I had sung throughout my young life, I had ached to play the guitar, and I began to do so around the age of 15, I think. I was at that time a runaway and managed to find my way into a bizarre experiment of a hippie school in Grayton, California, called Nonesuch. And the 8 or 9 girls around my age, I was the only boy over 8 there. It was an all-ages school. Probably 6 or 7 of the 10 girls all played guitar at various levels of skill and sang and knew folk songs. And so essentially they were my real teachers. They helped me to begin to acquire the ability to manipulate that very difficult instrument. And I was ecstatic about it. The feelings that I experienced when making music were feelings of liberation and wonder, and curiosity and mystery. I've always adored music, but I think it's really important to understand that it's one of the endogenous, right, naturally occurring features in ourselves that leads us out of the very squished up trap that our collective representations, which are empty inside, are inclined to deliver to us as our experience of day-to-day life. Surely the singer is transported when singing. Transported where? Not that kind of transport. Almost made mysterious and mythical, right? When someone begins intoning a song with great passion and skill, the audience is lifted up into something resembling a superposition of their ordinary feelings and sense of the world. When the music begins, if it's true and good, everything changes. So it is one of the great doors in our lives to a richness far beyond what we ordinarily experience. many of us, sometimes. So obviously the word music is related to the word muse in ancient Greek. Now the Greeks had this idea that we have lost but is very important, and it was more than an idea to them. It was their experience, meaning prior to reflecting on it, it was their experience. And the idea was the idea of a hypostasis, right? That all of the features of our experience here on earth, and all of the beings and objects with which we're in relation, these are not representations of the dead kind that we moderns have. They were representations in a different way. They were lesser infigurations, right? Lesser figures of principles and beings at the order above ours. The obvious place for that order is the sky. So the muses were known as the origin of the urge to make poetry or write or learn history, perhaps mathematics. And there were different muses for different things at different times. But musicians in general will acknowledge, at least those who compose music or sing, right? Or bark. That something comes to us. We reach toward mystery with our souls and our hearts, and there's a response from the great miasma of time-space and life. And so the songs come to us from a place we would do well to think of as at least magical. And the well-made songs and the beautiful singers are certainly enchanting us, as do our actors and dancers and painters and writers and so on. You can see there's cross-pollination between all of these arts. I remember reading, for example, some of Nabokov's works after hearing Sting mention them in a Police song. And I'm fairly sure that the song Life During Wartime by the Talking Heads is about Lucius Shepard's book of the same title. An astonishing book that I deeply recommend. He's passed away now, but he was a science fiction author. Of course, there should be a muse of something like prophecy, or of divination, or something like this. And many of the songs seemed both incredibly powerful in their own right, but also as speaking about features of life, experience, and existence in such a rich way that these features themselves became enchanted. And many of us, when we were young, we had songs that to us were deeply personal, almost as if they'd been written about me. And these became anthems for us, in a way. One of the anthems, though I had quite a few, that I deeply recall with pleasure and sadness, in a way, is Don McLean's American Pie. And in conversation with my son the other night, we began to wonder aloud whether or not, like, what was the actual situation with the songs that we found filled with this kind of personal, prophetic meaning. And we wondered, did my life follow the arcs and whorls of the song, or was I scripted by the song to live it out, or was it a combination of both, or was something else going on, and so on. And when I was young, we had libraries and bookstores. There was nothing like the internet. To find content, you had to either seek it out in an almost wishful thinking kind of way, like, does something like this thing I want exist? Right? Or you could try to find places where you could be exposed to the vast possibilities of literature and music. But mostly we figured out what there was from listening to the radio, and in Central California, the radio was fairly narrow bandwidth of musical styles. But again, in the 70s, most of the stuff on the radio was amazing. There was regular pop music, but it wasn't grim, almost never. And it didn't have the drumbeat gunshot rhythms familiar to so much of what I've vaguely encountered as modern pop music. It was a really different world. There were songs like The Wheel in the Sky, many Beatles tunes, Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody, Elton John was very popular, the Bee Gees, Led Zeppelin, The Who, right? And many of these bands, they wove a sort of magical identity through their albums, album to album. And so you could see that they're authorized to play roles, and we authorize them in our hearts to express the secret unspoken things that without the light of this music we would never find within us. So profound. Now, many musicians will agree that when making something truly beautiful, even if one is alone or in a small group, it is as if an audience arises beyond the players. And I think this sense is the sense of the near proximity of the muses. Whenever we begin to create, a radical transformation of who we are occurs. And we have the chance to reach for visions of who we might become, or what is possible, and the good and the true and the beautiful and the dark and the tragic and the mythic. And so this is such fertile ground for our self-development. Now each person has unique affinities and disaffinities. Not everyone, we might say, even though we'd be confused, is born to sing. But we should remember that the earliest sounds that we emitted as babies were musical sounds. And the tonality of language probably predates the arisal of anything resembling formal language in our species. In simpler terms, we probably began by singing and making rhythmic sounds together, with the capacity to articulate words coming much later. And so we all began as musical, and even in today's world, where at least in the United States, vast populations have sort of collapsed the tonality of their their speech into a fairly monotone situation, more so for men by far. Men are trained to monotonize, generally. We're not supposed to have music in our voices, according to the book of Sposta, by Johnny and Guido Sposta, Macmillan in New York, 1925. But if you listen carefully, especially to certain forms of communications behavior by humans, particularly when people are madly in love with each other, or if they are angry with each other, or there's some emotional content, you will hear much of the communication is transferred from words to tone. And tone becomes the communicative feature of utterances much more than the words in many of these situations. And of course, when we cry, we're essentially making music, very high-pitched sounds. And those high-pitched sounds carry. They carry really well. And one might imagine they can be heard by beings who are not merely human and responded to. Crying is in a way a sort of naive, by this I mean innocent, not duplicitous, form of praying. Our soul becomes impassioned or agonic, and we simply cry. So you can see that there's music everywhere. And the people who have and develop, we can each develop our skill with vocal tonality, even if much of our habits were acquired in childhood and maybe be relatively, at this point, relatively entrenched. Still, we can acquire a musical voice. And a musical voice is calming and beautiful and powerful. It's very persuasive when people have sophisticated vocal music. Compared to those who don't, we would almost always rather listen to the others because their speech carries more information than the words. Right? And thus has the capacity to really reach our interiority. And we begin to participate in whatever is being, communicated very much more directly, yes, much less abstractly. When composing music, and I encourage everyone to try it, there's no reason for you not to be composing music if you have any desire at all. There is a magic that happens immediately. And sometimes, in states of high creativity, I remember a young guitarist, neoclassical metal guitarist, who was extremely talented. He came to me one day when I worked at the guitar shop in Santa Rosa, and he described to me a long experience of entering a trance in his room while practicing these incredibly difficult, complex scalar patterns on the fretboard. And he described the room sort of fading away and the picture of Paganini, a violinist who was deeply influential on the beginning of neoclassical metal in America. Apparently, he felt that Paganini had come into his room and had a conversation with him and was teaching him. And I know he brought it to me because he knew something of who I was. And that I was at least, modestly educated about the forms and the scale patterns and so on that he used. And I learned from him. He taught me incredible things about pyrotechnics on the fretboard, so to speak. But I have also very often had the strong feeling that a being or beings are present with me when I'm composing, watching in a positive way, nurturing, encouraging, inspiring, helping me to form the beauty that I'm seeking, the mystery that I'm seeking. Before the advent of writing, the oral traditions of the transmission of philosophy, mathematics, geometry, religion, and so on, was very deeply entrenched. It was not uncommon for someone in a particular tradition to sing perhaps for days on end, reciting an entire cycle of songs. And it's obvious that music aids memory. The richness of our environment when I was young, having to quest for books, find out if they existed, discover them, ordering them, chasing them down, getting the money. It created a deep intimacy, and it was the same with the LPs. There was a personal relationship with these recordings that arose before one encountered them. And the cross-pollination of arts is profoundly nourishing for not just memory, which we think of in one way, the ability to remember something, but memory is a profoundly sophisticated jungle, right? A thriving jungle of processes and synchronizations and timing and all of these things, yeah? And so exposure to music, it not only transforms what we can be as human beings, but it changes literally the structure of our nervous systems, endowing them with features they would not otherwise acquire. Think of the dancer's nervous system, the singer's nervous system. Their whole body has become involved in this exquisite, exotic, to our everyday life activity. And it's not accidental that we may revere them as heroes or heroines. They give us the capacity to envision ways of being that we may not yet have been capable of imagining without them. Many religious texts actually have a song version. And when you hear someone, for example, reciting Vedantic sutras or the Upanishads or perhaps the Bhagavad Gita, you will notice that almost invariably they are singing. There's a standard sort of tonal system that overlays the language. And this doesn't merely make the content more memorable. It links it in memory in ways that without the music, it will never be linked. So you can see here again the wisdom of the Greeks, right? Memory is the mother of the muses, but the muses transform memory, and their capacity to synergize together, right, creates incredible possibilities for human experience and imagination, for memory and intelligence, for coordination, synchronization. Think of the military marches that soldiers are trained to lockstep to, and so on, right? Incredible synchronization across the group. How? Music. Again, creates a new form of time in which we are capable of things that in the ordinary form of time largely don't happen much, even if we're chasing them a bit. When I was young, a goodly portion of the music we were exposed to involved the beginnings, probably around the late 50s or something, of the availability of psychedelic drugs to young people. And so there were songs of madness and incredible strangeness. But these too became magical and transported us without drugs into an interior experience of another way of being. And so we identified, many of us, very deeply with our record collections and our book collections. And I still do to some degree, but not in the way that when I was young I did. That was a way of enchantment. This is more a way of nostalgia. Something like this. Though I still compose music on occasion. And I absolutely love to play and sing. It was very difficult to acquire the ability to synchronize my singing with anything more than a very basic strum on the guitar. I struggled with that for years and still have a little trouble here and there. But when writing my own songs, that issue mostly resolved itself. And composition has been one of the greatest joys of my life, even though I'm a relatively untrained musician. So think back again to those songs from your early years that deeply affected you and influenced you. The songs, some of which may have become anthems for you. And wonder with me together about the incredible untapped potential of music in our culture to both transform our culture, inform our culture, and enchant us with inspirations that we might otherwise never dream of. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.